Okay, if I could call the meeting to order, please. Panel members, please take your seats, and invited guests. We'll be resuming our public session of the Yukon River Salmon Agreement 2019 postseason meeting of the Yukon River panel. So as a quick update, just with regards to our agenda, carrying over from this morning, we will have two of the environmental conditions presentations delivered this afternoon. We'll be starting off with a bit of a rearranged order, the North Pacific Bering Sea marine conditions, and then that will be followed up by the Yukon River Canadian environmental conditions, and subsequently the Tay River Chinook salmon restoration project. So a little bit of a reordering. But to start us off this afternoon, I would like to take a moment to invite my co-chair, Mr. John Linderman. We'd like to just recognize an individual who's contributed to our processes over the years.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So I guess the cat might be a little bit out of the bag here already from Holly's presentation. But just to reiterate what she referenced is that longstanding federal representative to the U.S. section of the Yukon River panel, Mr. Fred Bew, who also serves as the current federal and season manager for Yukon River in Alaska, will be retiring. And just to give you a little bit more background on Fred's career, is that he did start with the Department of Fish and Game in Alaska, worked throughout back in the 70s. Various locations within what we call the Arctic Yukon-Kuskokwim region. So he's worked along the Bering Sea coast, up in the more Arctic area, Kotzebue, Norton Sound area, as well as spent many, many years working on the Yukon as the fall season manager. And just to give folks a little bit of a reference point, that's the same position currently that Jeff Estenson, who's been in that position ever since Fred retired in 2009 from the state of Alaska, of the context of Fred's background and history here with the Yukon River panel. As Holly mentioned, referencing and highlighting and thanking Fred for being a mentor to her as manager, and the long history and experience that Fred has had working on the Yukon in particular, I also feel like I've had the privilege of him providing some mentorship to me as well. I was lucky that when I moved into this position in 2008, and as the regional supervisor, Fred at least had a couple more years before he retired from Department of Fish and Game that I was able to work more closely and directly with him when he was with the state of Alaska and Department of Fish and Game. Another thing to mention is I think that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also very much so recognized the value of what Fred could bring to the table, and very quickly was recruiting him, for lack of a better term, recognizing his pending retirement from the state of Alaska to become the federal and season manager starting in 2009 until his pending retirement in a few short weeks. So, along that note, we definitely want to recognize Mr. Fred Bew. Fred, if you could please come up. So in preparation for this moment, we did have a plaque made for Fred. I know everybody can hopefully have a chance to take a look at this a little bit closer during breaks or after we're done here today. But I will read off what it says. Of course, we have the state of Alaska here recognizing a monarch, Fairbanks, and eagle. We tried to look for something that would show Yukon and a map that would show Yukon, but unfortunately the plaque maker didn't have anything available. But I'm going to still keep looking into that as far as I'm concerned. So Frederick J. Bew, with sincere gratitude for the dedication and committed participation in supporting the Yukon River panel, Yukon River fisheries, and the long-term sustainability of Yukon River salmon, presented by the membership of the Yukon River panel. And to some extent, recognizing Fred's longevity and commitment to his work, part of the reason that this lower part of the plaque is got this gold plate on it is because we actually had this made for him last December, and it said December of 2018, and he just apparently couldn't retire, and he had to go for another year. So we kind of sorted that out by coming up, and I think it actually came out pretty good. It looks nice with the additional gold plate that covers up the old text. So if that ever falls off, Fred, and you see different text under there, now you know why. Congratulations. Thank you very much. You're not getting away that easily. So I'd also like to ask Andy Bassage. I think he has something to also present and say to you.
So you're not getting off the hook that easy, Fred. As Holly mentioned, Fred is a very, very humble, very modest man, and we've got to prolong this intensity of standing before us and being even more humbled. He's sweating. I wanted to present this. I made this for you, and it is something that I made because I guess maybe I'll start by sharing. The first time I ever met Fred was at what they called an Eastern RAC Tri meeting. So there was all the representatives from the lower river, the middle river, and the upper Yukon River gathered in Wasilla. And it was the very first meeting I ever went to. I didn't know what I was getting into at all. I came in a day late because of weather. And that evening, I walked into the meeting and I didn't have a clue of what was going on. We all know what that feels like. And that evening, I kind of hitched up with Fred and we went out to dinner, and I learned everything he needed to know about the Yukon River and chum salmon that evening. No, but honestly, Fred has been a great mentor to me. He's been exceptional, in my view, of always looking at the needs of the user. And so I wanted to dedicate this, and I made this for you, from those of us who are the users on the river. And what this is it's an ulu, which represents the traditional way of cutting fish in Alaska. And it has a caribou horn. For the people around Eagle, our two food sources are salmon, both chum and king salmon, and caribou. And that's what we rely on. And it also is capped on the side by birch bark, recognizing that without the fish, the forests don't grow. The forests aren't healthy. And then, of course, the sheath is just made with king salmon tan, king salmon skin. I have it engraved. It says, "To Fred Bew," my eyes are getting worse, Yukon River Panel, 20 years of service from 2000 to 2020. And I wanted you to take this and thank you very much for all the service and mentor from all of us along the Yukon River. Really appreciate your time, your effort, and your willingness to talk with us at any time and to look out for our interests as best you can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you, Fred, for all your contributions. I noted that your transition in respect of your work supporting salmon on the Yukon River system went from the state to the federal government in the United States, and I thought we'd wait until the end of the meeting to tell everyone you're coming to work for the Government of Canada for the next cycle, but don't be surprised if we see Fred again sometime in the future, so thank you very much. I guess on the chapter of recognitions, we would like to recognize another individual who has contributed to the International Yukon River Salmon Agreement and the Yukon River Panel processes for a number of decades, a long-serving member on the Canadian delegation, in fact, who contributed to the original negotiation of the agreement, and recently departed as a long-serving member of the Canadian delegation. I'd like to call Mr. Don Taves up to the front. He's looking a little surprised, but we can rack that up to just having returned from overseas. I think it's safe to say only a few hours ago. So, Don, I'd like to, on behalf of the Yukon River Panel, on behalf of the people of Alaska and Canada, thank you very much for your contributions and years of service to our processes. And I will say Don's not retiring as of yet. He will continue to contribute in other ways, but we did want to formally recognize your contribution as a panel member over the years. And thank you very much for your service and importantly, the assistance and guidance that you've provided us over the years and your words of wisdom and calm demeanor. So thank you very much, Don. And I'll invite Mr. Alvon Finster up to the podium.
Yes, thank you, Steve. And Don and I worked together off and on, back and forth for the last 30 years, but actually longer than that. But his time on the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee was during the period when the Salmon Subcommittee was being put together and was trying to define itself. And I think Don did a good job of making that definition, helping us through the times that were hard, and just basically being there for us, bringing us back on track when we came off it. So I'd like to extend these cards and this presentation to Don.
Well, this is a very humbling experience. I wasn't expecting it at all. In fact, I still have my lunch in my mouth here that I was eating. I just want to say, the 30 years on the Yukon River salmon process, it has not been work for me. It's been a passion. And one of the most exceptional things of this whole process has been the people that I've worked with over this period of time, both in Alaska and in Canada. And people that were on the panel and people that attended meetings. And I want to say thank you to you. It's enriched my life enormously. And it's just been a pleasure to work with you. And you won't get rid of me yet. So I'll continue to come to meetings and be a thorn in people's side. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Don, and also Fred again. And with that, we will continue with our presentations this afternoon, and we'll start off with our marine fisheries and research presentation, and then I'll call up Mr. Jim Murphy, who will lead us off this afternoon.
Well, good morning. I'll come here closer to the mic here. Well, good morning. It's great to be back up here in Whitehorse and to see everybody again. My name is Jim Murphy. I work for NOAA Fisheries. It's also known as National Marine Fisheries Service. We kind of interchange those two terms, and I work as a fisheries research biologist in Juneau, Alaska. And I'm going to cover a couple of topics related to the eastern Bering Sea, some of the concerns that are there related to the warming conditions in the Bering Sea and the loss of sea ice. But I also want to provide some information on the northern Bering Sea surface trawl surveys that provide us insight into the status of the juveniles, and that's, I think, really important in terms of connecting these changes that we see in the Bering Sea to Yukon River salmon. So folks may be aware of the fact that the Bering Sea has been in the news quite a bit this last year, particularly the northern Bering Sea, and a lot of it stems from the concern over the loss of sea ice. There was a very substantial change. Let's see if I've got this figured out. Yeah. So there's a big change, a significant loss of sea ice in 2019. So these three figures kind of capture the magnitude of the change of the winter sea ice. So the figure on your left is 2013. You can see this is just a snapshot of a single day in March 1st, but you can see that the sea ice extends throughout much of the eastern Bering Sea shelf and extends all the way down into Bristol Bay. See if I can, oops. There we are. And so this level of sea ice is what I would consider a cold year in the Bering Sea, and that's kind of very typical of a cold year. In 2018, same date, March 1st, you can see that the sea ice only covers this shallow area of the northern Bering Sea. And that's largely been considered characteristic of a warm year. So we see kind of warm years, just the northern Bering Sea is covered in sea ice. Cold years, much of the Bering Shelf is covered in sea ice. And then you have 2019. So we've never seen anything quite like this before. There's very little sea ice, and by March 1st, the eastern Bering Sea was almost completely ice-free. And so there's a number of reasons that oceanographers believe contributed to this, and one of it was because of the exceptionally warm temperatures in the summer and the fall of 2018, that heat that was there in the water column really prevented the development of sea ice. And so it was in part because of the warm temperatures from the summer and fall. But also there was, they noted that there was persistent southerly winds throughout much of the winter, so air temperatures in the winters never really got that cold. So the combination of both of these factors is what contributed to the very minimal sea ice cover. So climate models all have predicted that eventually we'll lose sea ice in the Bering Sea, but this was not really expected to occur for another couple of decades. So this is quite concerning. And of course, we also saw record sea surface temperatures in the eastern Bering Sea. You can see that this red, it was just very warm, much higher than average. But it's also true in the Gulf of Alaska. Sea surface temperatures were also warm in the summer. So just overall, conditions were very warm this past summer, and partly to do with sea ice, but it was part of a bigger overall general warming trend in Alaska. The second figure here shows the temperatures on the seafloor. So these are the temperatures that are measured during the bottom trawl survey. And the blue areas up here are temperatures that are less than 2 degrees Celsius. So those temperatures are associated with what is known as the cold pool. That's a byproduct typically of the winter sea ice the year before. So fairly limited extent of the cold pool. And the other feature that was quite striking was the very warm temperatures in the shallow coastal areas along the shelf. And I think this essentially reflects the warm temperatures that we were seeing in freshwater. In the rivers, as everyone knows, these were some of the warmest temperatures that we've seen. So that introduced a lot of heat into the coastal areas of the eastern Bering Shelf. And of course, this all comes back to the record warm air temperatures that we saw throughout much of Alaska in midsummer. So there are a number of concerns that kind of are emerging because of the warming of the eastern Bering Sea. One of those concerns is how it's affecting the distribution of groundfish resources in the eastern Bering Sea. I'm not going through all these slides, but what I'll say is that there's increased concern that the warming of the eastern Bering Sea is shifting the groundfish resources further north. So there's going to be increased movement of groundfish resources into the EEZ, of the Russian EEZ, and it's also going to be increased movement of groundfish resources into the Bering Strait and Arctic habitats. The other thing that was of concern in 2019 was the occurrence of these mortality events in apex predators like marine mammals and seabirds. Ice seals in particular had much higher mortality rates. In the last 2 years, the mortality rates in ice seals is about 5 times higher than their historic average. And this is likely tied to just the physical loss of sea ice. That's their habitat. You start losing sea ice, and ice seals lose habitat in the Bering Sea. The other thing that happened this past year was fairly significant die-offs of seabirds, in particular shearwaters, where thousands of shearwaters were washing up on the beaches throughout the Bering Sea and in the Arctic shores. Another emerging issue is the presence of these algal toxins. And so this is some work that Kathy LaFay is doing out of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. So she was looking for the presence of algal toxins within the food webs. And this particular survey was done on the Healy, where they were looking for algal toxins in the North Bering Sea and also all throughout the Arctic. And so there were 2 locations where they found algal toxins that were above the seafood regulatory limit. So these were considered toxic algae. In both cases, they were in clams. One was up here in the Arctic, and the other one is here in just north of St. Lawrence in the northern Bering Sea. And walrus, clams are the primary prey for walrus. And so they think some of the mortality events on walrus actually tied back to these algal toxins that were present in the food web. So there's overall concern over the changes that the warming climate is how it's impacting the eastern Bering Sea, but it's important to really understand how those impacts translate to individual species. And this is where the northern Bering Sea surface trawls can help provide context and how these changes in the ecosystem are actually impacting Yukon River salmon. One of the key products of the survey is the information that we collect on the distribution and abundance of juvenile salmon. So these figures here show the overall distribution pattern of Chinook in the North Bering Sea. This is kind of a composite over 10 years. I've included the 2018 distribution of juveniles, and their distribution is essentially what we would expect in a warm year. They tend to be distributed further north in warm years compared to cold years. Their distribution in 2019 was a little bit confusing. It's very atypical. We essentially saw a more northward distribution of juveniles, which would be expected in a warm year, but we were also catching Chinook salmon at the southern end of the survey grid. Now, they do occur in the southern end of the grid, but that would be a pattern I would expect in a cold year. So 2019 was not a cold year. My concern here is that we could be seeing movement of stocks from the southern Bering Sea that are moving into the North Bering Sea. So we do collect information on the genetic origin of the juveniles each year. So we haven't finished the genetic analysis on 2019. But that will answer whether we're seeing movement of southern stocks into the North Bering Sea. There's a couple points here I want to point out. The lightest portion of the bars up here at the top is the percentage of non-Yukon Chinook. So essentially 10 to 15% of the Chinook are from non-Yukon stocks. So this area in the North Bering Sea is primarily a Yukon Chinook salmon rearing area. And the non-Yukon portion typically is around 10 to 15%. So there's other stocks like in Norton Sound, Unalakleet River, so they also contribute to that. There's some years, like in 2017, where we saw the proportion of non-Yukon stocks increase to 25%. So that most likely means that there is some movement from like Kuskokwim or Nushagak stocks. The other feature, excuse me, here is this dark portion of the bars is the proportion of Canadian origin Chinook. So that's typically held right around 45 to 50%. But we did see in 2018 the lowest proportion of Canadian origin fish that we've seen since we started the survey. So this introduces now some uncertainty as to what we would expect to see in 2019. Before, in the fall, I would always just take the average proportion of Canadian and produce a preliminary estimate. But we decided this year that given the uncertainty in what the proportions are, assuming an average proportion of Canadian origin fish was not really appropriate. So this is actually the mixed stock abundance index. So this is the abundance of all Chinook in the North Bering Sea. It's not the Canadian origin abundance. But what you can see is that the abundance of Chinook salmon in North Bering Sea has been below average for the last 3 years. And I think it's reasonably safe to assume that that is also going to be true for the Canadian origin stock group. And that's concerning for future runs to the river. But the low abundance of juvenile Chinook was specific to Chinook. We saw all the other species of salmon have catch levels that were well above average. We were seeing large numbers of sockeye, large numbers of pinks. Coho numbers were well above average. And so this is an example of the pink salmon abundance index. This is 2019. It was the second highest index that we've seen, but it was very close to the highest level we've ever seen in the North Bering Sea. This model here shows the relationship between juvenile abundance and adult returns. And so that means that we have a reasonably high degree of confidence that we'd expect to see record returns of pink salmon in 2020 based on just the juvenile abundance. This figure here, another important aspect of juvenile is to examine how well they're growing. And size can approximate growth in some circumstances. What I want to point out here, the blue line is Chinook, the red is chum, and the yellow is pink. And in 2019, Chinook, chum, and pink salmon all had about average size. So there's no real evidence from that to say that salmon were growing poorly in 2019. The only species that had still below average size was coho, but coho have multiple ages, and so changes in their size doesn't necessarily reflect growth. I think this is reflecting a change in their freshwater age composition. So in general, I would say juveniles appear to be growing average, growing well. The abundance of all the other species are doing well. The only exception to what might be a good year is the abundance of Chinook. There's something happening with Chinook specific to Chinook. So just to wrap things up, there are a number of concerns that we have about the Eastern Bering Sea and how warming climate conditions are affecting the habitats and ecosystem of the Eastern Bering Sea. Juvenile Chinook were below average in 2019. However, why their abundance is low is not very clear. There could be some issues happening in that very initial early marine life stage, or there could also be issues occurring in freshwater that we don't fully understand. And one of the things I think is really important, the delta work that's being done is really what we have to do to try to kind of bracket where this problem in survival is occurring in Chinook, whether it's happening in a marine environment or whether it's actually happening in freshwater. The other species of juvenile salmon appear to be doing well. And just to reiterate, the total catch, we don't have abundance indices for all of them, but their total catches were all well above average in 2019. And the pink salmon abundance actually was the second highest that we've seen since we started the survey over 16 years ago. And the growth of the juveniles seemed to be okay. There's no real evidence of poor growth in any of the species of salmon. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy. So questions from panel members, go ahead, Andy Bassage.
Thank you very much for that. I had some questions in regard to the effects of warm water and food sources or food abundance. You're saying that the juveniles seem to be growing normally. Is there any effects of the warming waters on the adult salmon that are spending 3 or 4 years, 5 years of their life out there?
Yeah, I think there it's good to keep in mind that the adults can move. They're much more effective in migrating and finding optimal habitats, whereas I think juveniles are going to be much more restrictive in being able to find the habitats that are more suitable. So on that end of things, I think that adults could potentially compensate for warmer temperatures perhaps a little bit easier than the juveniles. The other factor with that is that adults can, in theory, drop deeper in the water column. So what we're seeing on the graphs I was showing you, those are temperatures at the surface. But if you come down about 20 to 30 meters, those temperatures are a bit cooler. Whether or not they're losing important prey in those upper surface, in the upper waters is another question. But those are some things to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And then the other question I had is in the juvenile monitoring, is there the delay? When you say 2019, there's a fairly low abundance or very low abundance of the juveniles, is that something we're going to see in 4 years from now, or is there some other kind of relationship there that's going to be a predictor for us for the upcoming year? How's that ratio, or how does that coalesce with each other?
Yeah, so we've developed the models that link these juvenile numbers to adult returns, and it's a fairly good relationship. Chinook salmon spend about 3 to 4 years in the ocean before they return to the river. So any one given year is going to affect returns 3 to 4 years in the river. And so there's multiple brood years in a run, so it will always be an average of like 2 juvenile years that would contribute to the runs in the future.
I believe we had a question from Mr. Harvey Jessup. Go ahead.
Thanks, Co-Chair. Yeah, Jim, I think Andy asked the question I was going to ask, but I wonder if you do have a prediction now for 2020, 2021.
We're still waiting to get the final numbers from harvest and age composition. And once those numbers are complete, we will have a final outlook. And so we're planning to have that available during the spring meeting.
Question from panel member Carl Sidney. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you, Mr. Murphy. My question is, I'm wondering how long have records been kept on warming of the Bering Sea, and has this occurred before? And I'm just wondering if you guys have any discussions or whatever with other places, such as on the Mackenzie River where Chinook salmon are showing up. I'm just wondering if you guys have any discussions with people in that regard. And I have some other questions, but not really related to this, but because Jim is from Juneau, I thought maybe I'd ask him later. After, thank you.
Yes. So there is efforts to try to understand kind of what is happening in the Arctic. And that's, you're thinking the Mackenzie River, was that correct? So there's an effort to try to understand colonization versus straying of salmon, and how the salmon abundance is changing in the Arctic system. And so there's a number of scientists that are looking at that fairly carefully. As far as temperature records, we have temperature records that go back into the 1800s in terms of marine temperatures. And so we've seen warmer temperatures in the eastern Bering Sea, but we've never seen this extent of loss of sea ice. So that's one thing that's new, I think, in 2018. I think temperatures were quite warm. Not as warm as they are now, but we have seen warm temperatures back around the early 2000s.
My other question, not related to this, but because you're from Juneau, and I had this question earlier today when Canada and the United States were presenting their chum reports. And there was a time when Juneau released millions and millions of chum fry. And not only Juneau, but Japan and Russia, I believe. And I'm just wondering does that still happen? Does Juneau still do that? And I'm just wondering if it has any correlation with the low runs of chum salmon, when they do release them, all that fry into the Bering Sea?
You're asking the chum runs in the Yukon or the low Chinook? Yes, they still do. They have large production hatcheries in Southeast Alaska. Makes up about 70% of the chum salmon harvest in Southeast Alaska. And Japan also releases a lot of chum salmon as well.
And I think the second part of Mr. Sidney's question is there any indication of interactions between the northern Bering Sea subadult salmon and, we'll call it hatchery release origin salmon, or do they occupy different areas? Because I know in your one slide you'd pointed out that there were other stocks that were occupying the Bering Sea. Can you comment on that? Or?
Yeah, so that's kind of a big question. One thing that's important to realize is that Western Alaska Chinook salmon tend to remain in the Bering Sea their entire life. So it's only going to be the other stocks in the North Pacific that are also in the North Bering Sea. So Southeast Alaska chum salmon tend not to migrate into the Bering Sea. They're primarily in the North Pacific and in the Gulf of Alaska, although there could be some that do stray up into the Bering Sea. That's not their primary rearing habitat. On the other hand, you have Japanese chum salmon, which do utilize the Bering Sea quite extensively. So there's potential for competition between Asian chum salmon and Western Alaska or Yukon Chinook salmon. The difference is that they don't feed on the same things at all. They don't overlap at all. So there's potential, but it's probably unlikely, would be my guess. But you don't know. I mean, we can't measure that. But the fact that they eat completely different things means that the potential for competition is perhaps a little bit less than it could be if they ate the same food.
We have an additional question. Mr. John Lamont is joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Murphy, my concern is the Pacific cod moving further north, and they do prey on Chinook, juvenile Chinook. And is there concern related to that? Thank you.
Excuse me. Yeah, so that was one of the surprises too. You're referring to just large-scale shift, particularly in cod, that their distribution moved much further north than what we've seen before in the past. And what I don't have is the diet of those cod, and that's where I would look. I think what I've known in like the Gulf of Alaska is that it's actually fairly rare to see predation by some of these groundfish on juvenile salmon. Some of that has to do with their vertical distribution. Now in the North Bering Sea, you don't have a lot of depth to work with, so I would have to look at the diets of those fish before I could say whether it was an area of concern, and I don't have that data.
Go ahead, panel member Ragnar Ahlstrom.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Murphy, you kind of touched on this just a little bit. The northern Bering Sea is fairly shallow sea. Mm-hmm. You see a receding sea ice. Is NOAA tracking current and weather pattern changes also in regards to the sea ice moving north?
Yeah, there are a number of scientists, both within NOAA, but also within universities, that are spending quite a bit of resources studying the current patterns in the oceanography in the area. One thing that they've put in place is a series of moorings right across the Bering Strait. So they're actually able to measure the currents, speeds, and the currents through the Bering Strait. So that's an important part of the whole flow of the, so that's where a lot of the flow from the Bering Sea flows into the Arctic. So the amount of water moving into the Arctic system from the Bering Sea is a big part that drives the Arctic ecosystem. So they are monitoring that. They have moorings that measure all that. I don't know all that data, I don't have all that data, but I know they are measuring it.
Mr. Co-Chair, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks again for a great presentation, Jim. I'm not surprised at the amount of interesting questions. With respect to some of the ocean temperatures, water temperatures, I'm thinking of some of the specific figures you showed, that the expectation that a lot of the summer warm ocean temperatures was likely influenced, if not caused, by outflow from the various eastern Bering Sea drainages, such as the Yukon. Do you, and I know your figures didn't show it, but do we know if it's the same thing on the other side of the Bering Sea with respect to Russian tributaries, or whether or not they had warmer temperatures that may have been having an influx of warm fresh water into the Bering Sea on the opposite side?
I imagine that they were also probably experiencing warm conditions. I don't know if they were experiencing quite the extent that Alaska was experiencing. It's also important to know that on the Russian side, current goes in the other direction. So it comes from the north and comes down the coast of Kamchatka. So I think it'll always tend to be cooler on the Russian side than on the U.S. side, which you have southern currents that come north. Just that general pattern is always going to result in Alaska being warmer than at the same latitude on the Russian side.
Question from panel member Carl Sidney. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Because the Bering Sea is warming up, and I'm just curious as to what all it does attract. Does it attract such as harbor seals, who are their main diet is Chinook salmon, and sea lamprey and all them? Do they increase with the warming water temperature?
So the National Marine-Mammal Laboratory, which is part of NOAA, they track the status of a lot of ice seals and other. I don't know if there's harbor seals up there, but there's belugas. There's many different species of marine mammals that they track. I don't think that there's, I don't know how much, it's a little bit harder to get diet information on some of these marine mammals, especially if they're protected. It's a little bit easier with fish sometimes, where you can kill them and look at what's in their stomach. Marine mammals are a little bit harder to get information on diet. The species like sea lamprey, we actually catch lamprey in the Northern Bering Sea survey too, and that is tied to the Yukon River run of lamprey. And we've done work to look at the genetic material in the stomachs of lamprey. And so we've been able to figure out that based on lamprey diets, we see very little predation or parasitism on salmon. Most of them are gattids, like actually pollock and cod tend to be more often in the genetic material in their stomach is reflecting, like sand lance, I think pollock, and possibly herring. I think those were the most important species in the diet of lamprey.
Panel member Fred Bu, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This kind of goes along with Ragnar's discussion about the currents, but as managers, we're always trying to figure out timing of fish. In the past, we used to think about temperatures as being a trigger of when fish would start their onshore movement. But with the Bering Sea opening up so much ice-free, is there indications that fish are taking a longer route on the way back. Maybe it's not so much that there's fewer fish, but they're following the forage and taking a much longer route so that the onset of migration is reaching the river delayed from what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that the loss of sea ice has a lot of different aspects, and it could very well be changing the migratory patterns of adults, and that could continue to change as we lose sea ice further in the future. But we don't have data. We're not sampling at that time period.
Question from panel member Dennis Zimmerman. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. I have a bit of, did you want to add something?
No, there's somebody in the back. I just wanted to let you, there's somebody in back that has their hands raised, so I was just acknowledging that.
Oh, thanks very much. Years ago, I was more involved with the salmon issues, and an issue of concern at that time was the donut hole and the unrestricted fishing that would take place there. Is that still an issue? Could you update that? Do you have the information? Are salmon there?
Yes, salmon will be in the donut hole. However, the fishing in international waters does not occur, or at least does not occur legally, and they monitor vessels very, very closely. So I don't believe there's any fishing in international waters.
Panel member Dennis Zimmerman, go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. I guess I had a bit of a higher level question in the sense of if there's so much change, the pace of change and the variability and the atypical behavior and everything and all the multiple stressors on many of the fish. Some are positive, some are negative. Like how do you think that your models you're using are equipped to manage that pace of change? Because it seems like one data point will lead, one variability in the pattern will lead to more data you require, and the breadth of your work with all the different species. Do your models, are they equipped to deal with the level of change we have today? Would you agree with that or not?
So could I just ask a clarifying question? Models as in?
Well, I understand. I guess what I'm really trying to get to is how does this translate to management, right? We understand there's multiple stressors on these fish, and I want to know how it's going to result in a management change that will work in the best interest of these fish, for example. Yes. And I understand the connection between your data and the forecasts with the returning adults. So I understand those connections. I guess I'm questioning, those models that we're using have been around for a while. They're existing models. I guess how are you adapting those models to adjust to all the changes today, to the level and pace of change, or are you looking at new models or new ways of looking at this so you don't have to dissect every single data point?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think the models have to be based on data that you have. So I think my approach to that is we are looking very closely at their condition. So this would be their energy levels, looking at size, and we're also looking at their prey. So those things we can measure. And so I think my approach is that if we don't see any alarm bells coming from either what their condition is, what their size is, how well they're growing, then the only thing we can do is assume that the models relating to abundance that's all that you can do is assume that that's going to be reasonable. So we don't really see a clear relationship in size and condition with variation in our model, but it's just looking to make sure there isn't any sort of alarm bells or concerns within the juvenile population. So that's kind of my approach of being a little bit careful about just going forward with numbers.
All right, not seeing any further questions. I'd like to thank you for your presentation, Mr. Murphy, and we'll proceed with our presentation on environmental conditions in the Canadian portion of the Yukon River watershed, and I'd like to invite Ms. Vesta Mather, who will be presenting from Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
All right, thank you everybody. So today I'll be going over large-scale environmental conditions experienced by Yukon River salmon within the Canadian portion of the watershed between basically this time last year and this time this year. So that'll cover over from the eggs deposited in the fall through to the 1+ Chinook that have overwintered and the return of migrating and spawning adults. The primary environmental factors that we'll touch on are the water temperature, the effects and connections to air temperatures and precipitation, as well as the flow or the discharge of rivers, specifically the volume of water over a period of time, and those connections with precipitation, such as snowpack in the winter and rain in the summer. Now, these environmental conditions affect salmon in a complex manner and across their many different life stages, across the seasons and across the watersheds. So what we're looking at are these drainages within Canada, from the Porcupine drainage in the north to the southern lakes and Teslin in the headwaters, and focusing on those freshwater stages of salmon, so from the returning spawning adults through the outmigrating fry. Relevance of environmental conditions to specific life stages in the salmon environment, just a return to that life cycle, starting with what we've just experienced, the late summer and fall with adult migration and spawning, winter where the eggs are either incubating or 1+ Chinook are rearing and overwintering, through to spring when there's both emergence of the alvin and the fry, or beginning to move into fry growth or redistribution or outmigration of the 1+ Chinook. And of course that time in the ocean that Jim's given us an overview of, followed by adults returning. For an overview of some of the potential positive and negative impacts on these life cycles, starting with water temperature. So in the spring, starting with emergence, there can be positive impacts of water temperature for growth, more growth with an earlier or warmer spring, faster growth prior to outmigration, and continuing through that with growth in a warm summer for the fry. Although in late summer and fall, those high temperatures, potentially high temperatures, can lead to stress, pre-spawn mortality, and problems with egg viability. And impacts in the winter of water temperatures can include, again, positive influences on growth and development, but potentially also negative influences due to changes in the physical environment. In terms of flow, again, if we start in the spring, there can be negative impacts from high sustained discharges, which force movement, perhaps before the young are ready. Although different water levels, depending on the system, can also create different habitats depending on the physical availability. And this is something that's also important in the summer, depending on what life stage the fry or the young of the year are at and what kind of system they're in. High and low discharges through the late summer and fall into migration and spawning of adults can also lead to stress through delays or barriers or high water velocities during higher flows. And again, in the winter, there can be those physical changes to the stream depending on the water level. Next, I'll move into the conditions that we saw over the past year, and I'm going to show a couple maps like this, so I'll take a minute to explain them. These are maps from a quarterly bulletin on climate trends and variability for Alaska and northwestern Canada, and they're produced jointly by Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy. And I like them because they're a bit more to the scale that we're looking at rather than perhaps a Canada-wide graph. So the top ones will be showing air temperatures and the bottom precipitation. And what these maps are showing on the large scale is departures from the normal. So for instance, in this first one for this previous fall, the yellow is indicating warmer than average conditions over the majority of the Yukon River drainage. And for the precipitation, it's indicating where the green color is a wetter year, a wetter season. So what we're seeing in fall 2018 is precipitation above average in the Porcupine River watershed and precipitation below average in the upper and main stem headwaters. So where that larger circle is there in the yellow. Moving through to winter 2019, so from this past December to February, warmer than average conditions observed in the Porcupine and upper portions of the main stem, precipitation above average in the northern Yukon, although below average in the main stem and headwaters region. And for spring 2019, so March through May, again, warmer than average conditions throughout the drainage, and generally precipitation below average as well. Now, as to how this affected snowpack that was available in the spring, these are 3 consecutive charts produced by the Yukon Government Snow Bulletin. So you can see just a pattern here, March through May. Your oranges indicating below average snowpack, and the cooler colors, the greens and the blues, indicating above average snowpack. And the snowpack we ended up with in May, the large picture I want you to notice here is that pretty much everything was below average with the exception of the White River drainage, which was actually 101%, so pretty much average, and the Porcupine drainage, which was above average. So how did this play out into the summer in terms of water level and discharge? Each of these graphs represents a certain area of the drainage, and there's a lot of them here, but what I want to show is the overall pattern. So each graph indicates data from the Water Survey of Canada. I'll note that all the 2019 data for the Water Survey and for the temperatures that are shown are still preliminary. But what this is showing you is the time on the horizontal axis, so from June to August, and then flow on the vertical axis, so magnitude of river discharge. The wide blue line indicates the mean, the historic flows over the past record, and the width of the line indicates kind of a confidence interval. So it's the 95% discharge that you should be seeing in those locations. And the red is this year's measurements. So all of these, we see that the red line is, if not at the bottom, far below the blue line. So what this is telling us is that drainage-wide, significantly less than mean flows were happening. Also note some small bumps here in the Pelly River drainage, here and here in the Stewart River drainage, likely indicative of the spring freshet, so the main spring melt, and then the alpine freshet, so when alpine is melting. And the magnitude of those, generally speaking, is smaller than we would expect, again, likely due to that reduced winter snowpack. And so that was a regional perspective on all the drainages within Canada. To zoom in on 2 of them, the Porcupine River here and the Pelly River here. These graphs are the same as previous. They just have the indication of a whole bunch of little black dots, and each one of those little black dots is an individual daily record for an individual station. So the main point they're making here is that in the Pelly River, this year's record, the red line, is really extremely at the bottom of those observations. Well, in the Porcupine drainage, although the red line is below that time series mean, it's still within the range of conditions previously observed. On to the air temperature and precipitation for summer 2019. So this is over a time period of June to August. There were warmer than average conditions throughout the upper Yukon River watershed, so specifically this yellow here. and precipitation over the summer was below average in the Porcupine watershed and slightly above average in the main stem headwaters. So how did this impact water temperature and water levels? So what I'm going to start with for water temperatures is again preliminary 2019 data coming from our new project, which monitors these temperatures thanks to panel member Alvon Finster. And these graphs are showing you specific stations in 4 different locations throughout the drainage. So these are individual stations. And this is showing the spring conditions throughout the fall temperatures, so kind of starting to join all these together with the impacts on water temperatures for salmon. So along the horizontal axis, we're starting in May and ending in October over here. The blue line being that time series mean, that confidence, this is kind of the normal conditions, and the red line being this year's observations. And the stations we're looking at specifically here are water temperatures on the North Klondike River, the Stewart River at Stewart Crossing, Tatchin above above the highway crossing, and Yukon River at Anson Bend, so that's the upper Yukon River above the fish ladder. And what I want to focus on for these is the red line and what we're seeing at these specific locations. So temperature thresholds kind of start at about 18 degrees is when we're getting concerned, and that's based on research done in other systems. So how that compared to when the Chinook salmon, or the chum salmon if applicable, were entering these locations. And what we see is that there were high temperatures. So each of these axes goes up to 20, so about 18. So there were high temperatures in the water around the same time as those high temperatures occurred in Alaska. That high pressure dome in early July, Jim had a great map of it, was more focused on Alaska, but depending on the stream and the system, there could be different impacts felt. So we see a much colder water regime in the Klondike with peak temperatures here below 10 degrees, but still a bit warmer than average. And the salmon are likely moving into this system in this period through July. At the Stewart River Station, we see some of the highest temperatures between these 3, with temperatures crossing that 18 degrees and possibly approaching 20. This is about a little bit before the migrating adults likely moved into this system. In Tatchin Creek, those higher temperatures, higher than average, occurred before the salmon moved in. We have observations of them in August, so in this time period when they dropped off, and it is likely that salmon were holding and waiting for those cooler temperatures to be reached. And then at the Anson Bend location, not much above 15 degrees, and those would be salmon passing through that area after their passage through the fish ladder through August. So the main message I want to share from this slide is that there are slightly warmer temperatures. You also see that they've shifted slightly earlier. And then to look at temperatures for 3 drainages of the Yukon River. A is called the headwaters by the Water Survey of Canada. So for our purposes, we'll consider that as grouping these 3 drainages together. B being the Pelly River, and C being the Stewart River. And we do see some higher temperatures than average in the Pelly River. But given that these are groupings of stations, the effects, it's kind of representative of naturally how a river has different inputs, and so warmer effects may be moderated by cooler effects. And to finish off that discharge time series that I showed earlier for the fall, again here, the compilation of 6 major drainages through the watershed. And what's interesting about this is we were seeing some higher than average flows in the fall. So that may be something to consider as we think about potential impacts. Most of these flows were unlikely to be velocity challenges of any kind, and depending on the system, may have had different impacts there. So just to point out those higher impacts, slightly higher than average in the Pelly, the Porcupine, and the Stewart Rivers. And as for the past fall, that quarterly bulletin isn't prepared yet because we're still in their time period. So from another source, Environment Canada observed temperature anomalies. From the August through October period, they found generally temperatures were above normal and precipitation was below normal. And now I'll touch specifically on the Kluane chum because we know that's a recent issue and there's been lots of discussion about it so far. So when we look at drainage and discharge within this watershed, specifically within the White River watershed, a compilation of three river gauges there shows us that red line is definitely well below the average, and the impacts, the loss of seasonality is really seen when you look at a graph of water level at the outlet of Kluane Lake. The seasonality of increased melt is fairly well gone. It's fairly well precipitation driven now. So in 2016, the water flow to Kluane Lake declined significantly due to the withdrawal of a glacier, the Kaskawalsh Glacier. That meltwater now goes primarily into the Alsac River watershed instead of the Yukon River watershed. That input came via the Slims River, which is shown in these two photos from before and after the change. This is the entrance of the Slims River into Kluane Lake. It's not a chum spawning area, but it is a very strong visual representation of how the reduced flow has impacted the lake level. And consequently, by impacting the lake level, there's reduced flow to the Kluane River, which is one of the primary spawning areas of fall chum in the White River drainage, and has caused reduction in habitat accessible during the spawning period. So we're seeing some of those areas losing their inputs and transitioning to having less fish in them every year. And as Jeff mentioned, chum primarily return as 4- and 5-year-olds. So looking at our age composition at the return next year, we'll know what if we see significantly less 4-year-olds from the fish that spawned in 2016, we'll start to have an idea of the potential magnitude of the change. So to summarize all these environmental conditions and the potential impacts they may have had on salmon over the past year, winter had warmer than average temperatures, which can potentially be positive for incubation and juvenile growth conditions. Although increased variability in temperatures has effects on the physical habitat availability. So if you've seen a stream in January after a warm period, you know that there's impacts to glaciation, ice formation, and flooding. So this could have had a positive through to a negative effect depending on the stream and the salmon. There was a low snowpack in the majority of the watershed, and this led to lower water levels and increased variability in flows. This carried through to spring 2019, where those low snowpack led to low flows, which can have effects on the redistribution and the outmigration of newly emerged salmon and 1+ juveniles. And again, this can have a neutral or negative impact depending on habitat availability. So in terms of physical habitat availability, this stream flows directly into the Yukon River near Dawson, and the access to that stream, depending on the height of the Yukon River, may have potentially hindered juveniles' ability to redistribute into that stream, into that rearing area, depending on what the access to the main stem river looked like. So in summer 2019, water temperatures were elevated, but not extreme in the upper Yukon River watershed. This can have a neutral to negative effect depending on the duration of the exposure and the local variability where the fish are spawning. There's anecdotal observations of prolonged adult salmon staging, so waiting for cooler water prior to migrating into tributaries, and that choice would have a lot to do with what kind of tributary they're migrating into, what would the impacts on it be if it was a lake-fed tributary, if that lake was glacier-fed or not, and lots of physical considerations like that. And into fall and early winter 2019, Warmer water temperatures over this period may be decreasing incubation duration, so the amount of time those eggs are taking to develop. This could potentially lead to earlier emergence in the spring, but there's still a lot of the winter to go. And in localized areas, adult chum salmon migration and spawning was influenced by flow and temperature, so neutral to negative impacts depending on the location. So overall, the effects of environmental conditions on salmon depend on the salmon life stage and the specific environmental conditions in time and space. Salmon travel extremely long distances over time, and they pass through highly variable environmental conditions, so they're exposed to a lot of different things. In general, the migration, spawning, and rearing conditions in the Canadian portion of the Yukon River watershed were likely adequate for salmon over the past year. This is a large-scale overview. Variation between watersheds and even between adjacent spawning streams can depend heavily on those water sources and those physical components, which is why it's great to hear on-the-ground information from specific locations, and definitely appreciate all the comments and information and observations that have been shared over the past few days during these meetings. Thank you.
Questions from panel members? Go ahead, panel member Andy Bassich.
Thank you, Ressa. That's always really interesting. I guess I'm kind of curious, are there any long-range models that you look at for predicting some of the conditions in the main stem of the Yukon River over the next couple of years, or is this something that we're basically just monitoring year to year? And the reason why I asked that is I was really alarmed the last 2 years, actually, at the water levels, at how low they were. And I'm very concerned about the warm water temperatures that are often associated with that. And then many of you may not have been on the panel back in the early 2000s, but we had quite an issue with the warm waters affecting the salmon with the ichthyophonus. So I'm just curious if you have any long-term things, what we might be up for into the future. And I guess that was also just a heads up to managers and biologists that might be something we might want to put on our radar to keep an eye out for possible ichthyophonus if this continues over another year or two.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think the short answer to that is that there are certainly climate predictions and climate models. There's a lot of different ones, and unfortunately they mainly exist at a fairly coarse scale. So, individual cells that are maybe the size of a subwatershed, maybe the size of the whole watershed, but I think what's fairly clear is that things are going to get more variable and unfortunately probably less predictable, but by continuing to monitor what's happening and the effects they're having, we can be as knowledgeable as possible about future outcomes.
Question from panel member Alvon Finster. Go ahead.
Thank you, Vesta. That was a great presentation. Could you move back to the hydrometric data?
This one?
Yes. I just wanted to mention that as Vesta told us, this is preliminary data, and the uptick in the apparent uptick in the flows at the end of each of those lines is probably not flows itself. It's probably the effects of ice forming on the river, and when the ice forms on the river, it jams up slightly and it lifts the level of the water. That increases the pressure on the measuring device. And when the final data comes in, those will probably be smoothed off by the people involved. The reason I bring that up is that the work that was done in Alaska pointed out that high flows late in the season can cause a problem for spawning Chinook salmon. By late in the season, I mean late August, September, not into October and November when the ice is forming. Thank you.
Any further questions from panel members? Not seeing any. I'll express our thanks, Ms. Mather. And with that, we'll take a 10-minute recess, and we'll look at reconvening at 2:45, please. Thank you.